Okay, so welcome everybody to our third plenary session during this year's EuroMemo online conference. As you might already be aware, we had to shift our annual workshop to an online format given the implications of the corona pandemic. So we already started 2 weeks ago with the opening plenary. Last week we had a very interesting plenary on the socio-ecological transformation in Europe. And today we'll have a plenary on the international dimension of socio-ecological transformation. Before we go into that plenary, just let me announce that tomorrow we'll start with the parallel workshops. So tomorrow at 9 a.m. we'll have 2 parallel workshops. Workshop 1 will deal with macroeconomic policies, workshop 2 with critical perspectives on the European Green Deal. And then in the afternoon at 2 p.m. we'll continue with workshop 3 on feminist approaches to a Green New Deal and workshop 4 on the social and solidarity economy. Also on Thursday morning from 9 a.m. onwards, we'll have 2 parallel workshops. Workshop 5 dealing with production and consumption systems and the role of industrial policy. And workshop 6 dealing with the international dimension of socio-ecological transformation. The conference will then end with a final plenary on Thursday afternoon at 4 p.m. That plenary will discuss the policy proposals that have been coming out of the workshops, of the parallel workshops. So that's a little bit of a difference to a normal standard academic conference, that we also discuss the policy proposals from the workshops, which is important for then working on the production of our annual publication, which is the Euro Memorandum 2021. If you have any further questions, or if you need any further information on the parallel workshops, please do not hesitate to contact us at the following email address: info@euromemo.eu, which is the standard email of our group. Okay, so that's just in all shortness a few organizational remarks. I'm looking very much forward to our plenary discussion today, and thus I hand over to our chair, Maria Bartels. Maria, please, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Werner. So dear all, I also would like to welcome you at this, well, let's say second or third, it's a little bit confusing, in fact, plenary of the EuroMemo conference. So I'm Maria Bartel. I'm a professor of law at the University of Amsterdam. So after 2 excellent sessions that we had, which mainly focused on socio-economic exigencies of the transformations that, well, we hope await us. In today's session, we will focus on the issues of governance, and in particular on the future of global governance and the role of the EU within it. So I'm very happy to welcome 3 excellent speakers, Ingo Wenske, Jan Orbi, and Angela Wigger, who will shed a light on 3 vital aspects of global governance for socio-ecological transformation, namely the role of international law, the role of EU trade policy, and the role of EU industrial policy. Now, I'm also sorry that the 4th speaker, Nana de Graaf, could not join us today, but as you will see, you will not miss out. So a final housekeeping remark. So please do ask us questions in either chat or in Q&A section of the Zoom. If you please do so, and you know, in case that it is of course a little bit difficult sometimes to know whom you are speaking to. So if you would like to not be mentioned once we ask the speakers the questions that you pose, you can just write that you would like to keep it anonymous. But in any case, please do feel free to pose questions. We are very happy to respond them immediately after the three plenary speakers give their presentations. In the last part of the meeting, we will have then basically free exchange with whoever would like to participate directly in person. So also keep motivated until the final exchange. So now I will always introduce the speaker before they start to speak. And the first speaker today is Professor Ingo Wenske, who is Professor of International Law, also at the University of Amsterdam. And his current research focuses on contingency in the history of EU law, international law, and with a particular focus on the role of international law in entrenching conditions of social injustice. So Ingo will speak today about the centrality of international economic law for socio-ecological transformation, and in a way, I think, in a very well set the stage for the following presentation. So Ingo, floor is yours. We look forward to your presentation.
Great, thank you so much, Werner and Maria, for the kind introduction and the invitation to contribute to your conference to speak in this context. I prepared a presentation and I felt quite free in doing so, and also in thinking through what I said. You said we had a free exchange after our presentations, but I took some liberties in preparing. Voila, sorry about that.
Excellent.
So thanks again. So I'm international lawyer, as Maria said, and that will serve a bit as a defense in this context, but also I hope offers me a bit of a justice privilege. So when we talk about law, and large parts of debates at our law school are then about legality. So what is legal, what is not? And if there's something distinct to law, I think as an academic discipline, it is probably that we claim some expertise in knowing the law and claims about legality. But like other colleagues, like Maria, I'm also quite interested in the social effects of the law. Yeah, and that then brings us in closer contact to other disciplines. If we're interested in thinking through the role of law in fostering, sustaining, but possibly also prohibiting, inhibiting transformative change, social, environmental change, we seek that contact and try to some extent live up to standards of other disciplines, never quite managing to do so, but enjoying a bit of a justice privilege, and with that privilege, perhaps seeing some things that are not so readily recognized otherwise. Especially, I would suggest for you, it's the role of the law in constituting the global economy. And now I understand that most of the participants today are economists by training, political scientists, political economists. And one suggestion that I have in return is that law is really very central in constituting the global economy and hindering and facilitating social ecological change. And that's something that I hope to bring home in the next 15 minutes or so that I have. It's something that tends to sometimes fall through disciplinary divisions, I think. Yeah, so that's one thing I want to argue. A second main argument will be that a key problem in the role that law plays in hindering, possibly facilitating the ecological transformation is the fragmented way of lawmaking. It's a main hindrance. So green industrial policy objectives are recognized as their industrial policy is a crucial vehicle of that transformation, but there are several disciplines in global economic law, international economic law, that's really my focus for today, that in a way haven't gotten the message yet. And I will focus on subsidies and procurement in particular. And I will close with a third argument on where I think might be sources for progressive change, and that's most likely to come, I will argue, from the bottom and the periphery. So those are the arguments that also set the agenda. I will start with the main problem with the fragmented lawmaking process. So it's clear that no domestic actor, no single state is unitary in the sense that it has a single foreign policy across societal fields. So when Germany concludes a bilateral investment treaty, it's the Ministry of the Economy that does so, not the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Their legal service might have something to say on this, but it's the specialized ministry that takes the lead. That's the same for environmental agreement. That's for extradition agreements. It would be the Ministry of Justice, and so on and so forth. And this fragmentation of international lawmaking across ministries is a phenomenon that is true a fortiori for the European Union, which has its origins, of course, as an economic community and its external relations as a customs union vis-a-vis other trading partners, to carve out that special place within the General Agreement of Tariffs and Trade. So what we can see for all domestic actors, for all foreign policies, it's particularly true for the external relations of the EU, where the DG Trade conducts, the Director General, the negotiations, of course, and in a way internationalizes that economic perspective through the agreements. And you can see how that trade perspective permeates and imbues most of what the EU does in its external relations. So even now, when it comes to the so-called sustainability chapters provisions in new free trade agreements, there was a recent blog post by Joseph Borrell that I will rely on a couple of times now, called Building Global Europe. It's really a bit of an eerie reading. It's it recognizes with glee the arguments about a geopolitical awakening of Europe, completely historically oblivious, as though, you know, you could say in one way it's avant-garde way of provincializing Europe, but that would be, I mean, it's absurd. So it's the claim that Europe must lead again, yeah. But okay, fine. So I could get carried away by the title of Building Global Europe. I will try to bracket that a little bit and just stick to my argument that here the rationale, even when it comes to sustainability chapters, is the one of creating a level playing field. It's a economic argument to not suffer a comparative advantage, and so on and so forth. The fragmentation is in many ways a hindrance to the socio-ecological transformation. In a very deep way, I want to suggest it's already in the definition of the problem, and in therefore then the identification of the suitable solution. So it's as much as you might like the inclusion of sustainability chapters, provisions on labor and on the environment, their inclusion will do little, if anything, to undo or even irritate the epistemic hierarchy that trade claims and maintains over alternative or competing rationality. So a common critique, also in a previous Your Memory report, it's a valid critique, are lacks of enforcement, and yeah, so that there's no strong mechanism to follow up that trading partners actually stick to labor and environmental obligations. Even if that were the case, if the administration of these agreements and the operationalization continues to stay with DG Trade, you will perpetuate an epistemic hierarchy of trade rationalities over competing rationalities. So you might think there's a bit of suggestion by those who really welcome these inclusions of labor and environmental clauses in new free trade agreements that the EU strikes with Vietnam, Singapore, and so on, Mercosur, that while we're all in the same boat, I mean, not only the Vietnamese and the Europeans, but we in Europe, so to speak. Whereas whereas I want to suggest that the free trade agreements can also be seen as an extension of an internal domestic conflict on competition, on which perspectives get to become internationalized. That's a traditional perspective on how to look at fragmentation, that in a domestic competition, some actors manage to internationalize their perspective. Here, trade, also to outplay competing perspectives on the European level, environment and social social polities. I could say more on that, but feel that I need to move on to say a few more words about the centrality of law for the socio-ecological transformation. That's well recognized. The previous Euro memorandum speaks on the constraints that will result from further regulatory cooperation that are likely to result from investment law and the possibilities of private investors to use interstate dispute settlement processes, overall focusing on regulatory chill. And to bring home the argument that international law is even more central than that, I want to look at two core disciplines that I suggested are still untouched by the impetus for progressive change, and then also say how the deep DNA of economic law stands against it. So I could go into very deep details. I still scratch the surface to some extent by just noticing how essential subsidies will be in the green industrial policy, and to note the dissonance between the recognition that this is the case on the one hand, and the renewed commitment of the EU on the other hand to still strengthen the constraints on subsidies. And that's an international trade law that comes in the form of the Agreement on Subsidies and Countervailing Measures. Yeah, I could say a bit about the structure of that agreement, but the core point is that it prohibits certain sets of subsidies straightforwardly, and notably had carved out originally a subsection for development, research, and also regional assistance. That exception has expired. There's no agreement on a renewed exception. It prohibits local content requirements, which may be an important component of industrial policies. So to cut the longer story short, there's that dissonance between the policies that the New Green Deal recommends on the one hand, and a renewed commitment to still stronger international regulation, a discipline, as you say, in economic law, to police, so to speak, subsidies. So this is a bit of a fine print of a trilateral meeting between the US, Japan, and the EU Trade Commission at the time, Phil Hogan, in DC only in January this year, where the three parties reaffirmed their commitment to add to the list of prohibited subsidies, including to prohibit subsidies that take the form of unlimited guarantees, to subsidize insolvent or ailing enterprises in the absence of a credible restructuring plan, to outlaw subsidies that would go to enterprises that cannot obtain long-term financing on the normal financial markets. a lot of things you might think that are, however, necessary not only for a just transition and perhaps also for the current COVID crisis and the social crisis that is connected to it, but also to invest long-term in green energy. A similar story I could tell in further detail with regard to procurement law within the EU and within international trade law. So the benefits and the possibilities of greening procurement are tremendous. Here on the right-hand side, you just have a couple of facts coincidentally connected to the impact of the Netherlands that it would have if the Dutch public authorities applied sustainable public procurement criteria, and that would save 3 million tons of CO2 emissions. And there's an immediate impact, a clear impact. But whether they can do so again is constrained, limited by legal obligations, including the agreement on public procurement in the WTO that in short prohibits discrimination of foreigners when compared to domestic suppliers. There's some exceptions, but the exceptions are phrased in a way that puts discrimination on the defensive. I'm happy to go into more detail in questions and answers. So there's a similar story where there's a impulse to suggest that public contracting authorities can and should award contracts taking into account the carbon emissions or the environmental impact and the climate impact that they would have on the one and the left hand, but on the right hand, a renewed commitment to strong policing of non-discrimination in procurement procedures. So the devil is in those details of the specific provisions of the agreement on subsidies and countervailing measures on public procurement, but it's also really deeply ingrained in the DNA of trade law more generally, which is all about non-discrimination, where social policies are by definition deliberately discriminatory, and environmental policies oftentimes are by implementation. That is something I've skipped over so far. There's an interesting case in the WTO, just by way of illustration, on the feed-in tariff, a case against Canada that the EU had initiated on Canada renewable energy feed-in tariff, where basically the consolation was that a green energy was not competitive on the market. So the public authorities created a market for green energy by guaranteeing a certain price. The finding was a bit ambivalent, but there was a suggestion that this would amount to a subsidy and to more favorable treatment of domestic producers, also because there was a local content requirement. But the case shows, and this is what I want to use it for in this context right now, that the policy to create that market was probably made possible in the domestic political climate by imposing or by using local content requirements. So you can imagine that a polity would be ready to pay a higher price for tariffs if it also benefits local companies, but would not be ready to do so if it was not local companies. So I think it's not incredibly well explained, I realize, but there is a political reality, I think, in decision making that may make discrimination necessary, which I mean to allude to by saying that environmental policy oftentimes is by implication discriminatory. So I want to close with a couple of words on where I see the possibilities and sources of change. First, by mentioning two things that I don't think are inspirational or sources for progressive change. One is, so there is a crisis in the WTO, an institutional crisis, as you may know, and more generally, a lot of international law is contested, strongly contested politically by many different actors, not only the so-called right-wing authoritarian populists, but also others. And there's a bit of tendency now, in speaking above all to my creed, of international lawyers to see this above all as a moment of great danger, and to cling to a good old liberalism of a rule-based over a power-based system, and to long for the 1990s, where where I would hesitate a moment and emphasize also how much that rule-based system expressed the preference of the powerful and was also a means of domination. Another thing I wouldn't want to emphasize is the false nostalgia. I already went on briefly on Borrell's Building a Global Europe, which might run into an argument where the Global South, after having been subject to a civilizing mission and to development policies, now would be continue to be treated as a polluting state. So the sustainability here would not need to be at the expense of others, but really should have to be a possibility for all. And that is, that would above all mean a lot of self-constraint on part of Europe, rather than a new geopolitical awakening. So more positively, then, I do think there's a bit of a flicker of hope in some suggestions at the moment, in the fact that carbon tax adjustments were long considered a taboo. That genie is out of the bottle, and I think that's a good thing. The Commission seems to embrace it straightforwardly, and I think that was part of the reason why another taboo was broken, which is the possibility of tax adjustments also on other counts. In the context of the Brexit saga, there was a suggestion that if the Britons were to slash corporate taxes, Europe might adjust it at the border, which is unheard of, but is also a good development. But I do think that the message of a European Green Deal has not that hasn't been received in quite a few of the core disciplines of economic law because of fragmentation. Yeah, so the Buying Green document, the handbook, was issued by DG Environment, while the DG Trade recommits to the agreement on public procurement that disciplines public procurement yet more strongly. I think there's a lot of attention on reform and change on the international level, at least what I see. Reform debates, let's say for investment law, that center on the UN Center for the on UNCITRAL, whereas I think there's quite a bit of potential rather in Berlin, and that could carry over to Brussels and then to Geneva, rather than the political processes in Geneva themselves. I think they're bound to be remaining quite limited. That's not only a nod to Maria, my last bullet point there, but really a strong conviction that I focus on international economic law, but a lot of goals that green and just transition aims at can well be achieved through private law mechanisms. Going back instead of forward. So to close, really that's my last slide. In preparation, bringing us together, Maria said that what we will have today is perhaps a bit of a critical international law, critical international relations take, and a critical political economist take. And I wanted to reflect in conclusion on what it might mean to have a critical take on international economic law. And I want to highlight 2 points of what that might mean. One is the adage, in a way, that law is typically is hardly ever only part of the solution. That's a bit still how it is treated in the documents of the European Union, also in preparation for today. If you read through all the policy documents, that's what we want, and now let's turn to the law to achieve it, which jumps over the fact, skips the fact that the law is so much part of the problem in enabling and constraining detrimental policies and constraining policies that would further just transition and an ecological transition. And the second thing that it might mean is that we would have to think harder. We would have to think through harder why that change has not yet happened. I mean, the 2 points are connected. And then it's not so much on intentions and guidance. So it's not so much that we need to say, well, look, dear DG Trade, you really haven't thought this through so much. Here's the memo from each DG Environment. Please be more serious about this. It's really to think through the institutional and material constraints of who does what and the career objectives of those who join DG Trade and so on and so forth, and not to hope for good intentions and guidance that will do the work, but to think through which alternative institutional arrangements and material reconfigurations could further the socio-ecological transition. That'd be my take for this afternoon. Thanks so much again for having me.
Thanks so much, Ingo. This was excellent. I hope I'm very curious on the exchange that will follow. So now we have a second speaker. We have to be a little bit careful about time. So the second speaker is Jan Orby, who is a professor of political science at the University of Ghent, and likely one of the most beautiful cities in the world, I have to add. So Jan's research focuses on the EU trade and development policies. And today he's going to talk us through the EU trade policy post-COVID. So Jan, the floor is yours. We very much look forward.
So thank you, Maria. I will, so I'm not Nana de Graaf indeed, but I'm happy to jump in here in this panel. And it's a big pleasure to discuss these issues with you. And I will talk about trade also, and specifically about European Union trade policy post-COVID. I should warn you, there's a lot of self-promotion here in this presentation. I will refer to several things I wrote recently and some stuff I've been thinking about. For instance, this working paper on the impact of COVID-19 on EU trade policy that you can find online. And of course, this is work in progress, but with some colleagues, we're doing sort of a discourse analysis on how EU trade policy talking has evolved or not since the COVID. And of course, the starting point is a question that I think intrigues all of us, neoliberal globalization, whatever that might be. Does it still exist? Is it reinforcing itself? Is it in danger? What is the fate of neoliberal globalization? There were some early messages, as you can see, announcements that this might be the end of neoliberal globalization. And of course, this question intrigues us. Do we see a paradigm change? If you look specifically at our field of expertise, do we see a new paradigm emerging there perhaps? And our starting point is, to be honest, a bit cautious. We have seen many crises in the past. We have also studied some of these. And we have, over the past 20, 25 years, always seen that crises have served to sort of reinforce the neoliberal paradigm or the free trade paradigm specifically, and to strengthen it rather than weaken it. So do we see it really here? What does it mean to see a paradigm change? What does it require? And we actually, first of all, in the paper, we identified 3 conditions that you can see here in the middle of that triangle. And it's a very pragmatic summary, actually, of a huge literature. First, what is the crisis? How is the crisis defined? Is it a virus? Is the virus the problem? Is it something Is it globalization? Is it something geopolitical? Is it China, etc.? Is it our health systems, etc.? Secondly, to what extent do we have alternative paradigms? Do we have something like Keynesianism, so to say, in the 40s, or alternative stories ready to be picked up? And then last but not least, of course, power shifts, referring maybe to the material base that Ingo referred to at the end of his presentation. Well, when you look at these three things and at the first months of the crisis and trade policy discourse and also trade policy practice, what we see is that well, we are still very close to this neoliberal part of the triangle. The more difficult question then actually is, what might paradigm change be? And by definition, this is difficult to imagine. What might be an alternative? And we identify actually two alternatives, because we think that too often trade discussions are framed into protectionism versus liberalization dichotomy, into a very simple dichotomy: either you have open markets, free trade, or you close markets, protectionism. And well, if you talk about protectionism, it has a very negative connotation, first of all, and it can mean different things. It can mean less trade, protection, but for many different reasons and in many different ways. And we think that both the securitization and the trade justice paradigms that you can see here on the slides involve some sort of protectionism, but in a very, very different way. So the securitization paradigm refers to a more geopolitical approach to international politics in general, and hence also to trade policy. The trade justice paradigm is a very different one, of course. Now, what we find is that in the very early days and weeks, so to say, of the crisis in March in Europe, there was some talk about reshoring, there was some talk about sovereignty, but these are concepts that have not really made it into the dominant discourse, where we see that neoliberal free trade agendas have been quite successfully reinventing themselves, so to say. There were some restrictions, also export controls, national then European export controls. There were some talks about, maybe we have to, have some exceptions, for instance, for key protective material. But this was all, first of all, very temporary, and secondly, clearly framed as the exception to the rule. So we don't really see a lot of change there, maybe contrary to what to how it has been framed in some discussions. And what we do see, however, is we do see a shift. So discourse is never static; it always evolves, and there's always things going on, and it's very hard to grasp. But what we think is we see a shift more towards the geopolitical corner of the triangle. We see, and it links a bit maybe to what Ingo said about the fragmentation of law, and also within the EU we have the trade versus CFSP, so trade versus foreign security policy. We actually see an increased coherence there in discourse, if you want, and we see some of the notions that were already dominant in European foreign policy discourse, like resilience and strategic autonomy, becoming part of the trade policy discourse. So if you would look at several documents, you will see resilience and strategic autonomy reframed as open strategic autonomy, and we can discuss what that means, and nobody really knows. But there is some interesting, coherence there with Europe's foreign policy discourse, as it has been very, summarized into the global strategy of 2016. So this is the European global strategy, where resilience and strategic autonomy are indeed key concepts. And there's also it also resonates very much with an emerging, hostile discourse towards China, being labeled as a systemic rival. early 2019. So there too, we see that EU trade policy discourse post-COVID, and of course it was already going on a little bit before the COVID crisis, but then it was very much strengthened in terms of also not being naive anymore. We can be open, but we should not be naive, and maybe we should diversify, and maybe we should be a bit more autonomous, and especially towards China. So this is more or less how we would summarize it so far. So on this line, you see that trade policy discourse, the neoliberal core remains, but there's some movement towards the geopolitical, and there's some alliance also, you could say, in Brussels, in a way discursive alliance at least, between the foreign policy sphere and the trade policy sphere. And it will be interesting to see how vulnerable this is, how strong this is, how this will evolve, because of course there are tensions there. But the core idea of liberalization and the needs of more market openness is not really fundamentally questioned there. And we identify a few reasons why we think that this has been the case. First of all, Digitrade within the EU, as Ingo also I think referred to, remains a very powerful, a very strong compartment of the European institutional machinery, and it has managed to sort of regaining the initiative over trade and foreign policy by co-opting these discursive elements. It also allows us Europeans to not blame the system, but to shift the responsibility towards others who need to be more resilient, value chains that need to be more resilient, but not towards the neoliberal globalization. It's also compatible with diversification, liberalization, and it creates potentially more leverage towards China in terms of market openness. So what does that mean for trade justice and for this bottom corner of the triangle? What surprised us, but maybe the other panelists or people in the audience can point us to some things we have missed. But we had the feeling that the trade justice movement and also political actors arguing in favor of trade justice have not really been very strongly engaged with the trade policy debates, or at least they have not managed to become a dominant voice in these debates. It took quite some time before we saw some engagement between the trade of the trade justice movement, so to say, with the COVID crisis and what that implies for trade justice. And there's one interesting exception, I think, if you look at the fair trade movement, the European fair trade movement, the advocacy that they have been doing. There's an interesting emphasis on resilience. As you can see on the slide, there's been a lot of initiatives where suddenly resilience entered the fair trade discourse. That was not the case before. Before 2020, resilience was never mentioned in any of these, or hardly ever mentioned in any of these fair trade documents or programs, manifestos, and suddenly resilience comes up post-COVID. Now, what I have tried to criticize here in another blog that you can find on the DIE website is that this resilience discourse might be unintentionally, of course, might be dangerous. What we do by shifting the focus on the resilience of workers, the resilience of people working in textile, for instance, and the resilience of supply chains, is that you kind of treat the crisis as something external that cannot be controlled, that is there, and you shift the focus towards the symptoms, the consequences, and us or workers, especially in the global south, having to deal with these consequences. So the point that I was trying to make there, and it's not an original point, many scholars have made this point on resilience in other contexts, but I'm making it here in the context of fair trade, where I think it can be dangerous to frame the issue so much in terms of need for more resilience, because ultimately the core of the problem is the global economic system that that drives, that makes it that prices are low, and prices of many commodities at least are low, and that they are unstable and highly fluctuating, and with devastating consequences, especially in the south, but also in the north, actually. So we have fair trade, we have just trade, we have inclusive trade. So there's a lot of words that we have there. Adding resilience will not solve much. I think the key question really is, what is fair trade and what is a fairer trading system? And again, I don't think we have had many such discussions in the context of COVID. So when people ask me, what do you propose then as an alternative, I should first of all say it's not my core business to elaborate policy proposals, but I'm very happy to have a discussion here at the EuroMemo, and I did write a blog for a German organization that you can see here projected on the slide, where I try to make some proposals, or at least elaborate some initial ideas, where generally I think the COVID crisis has made it clear how vulnerable the world economy is and can be, and especially for people in the global south, but also here in the north. It has posed a lot of vulnerabilities, also the disadvantages of ever increasing trade, the impact of more and more trade and growth on ecosystems also, and so on. I think we have to have a serious discussion about free trade regimes and the World Trade Organization. It always strikes me that also progressive voices, also people, the development movement, for instance, feels obliged to defend the World Trade Organization and to defend the rules of the World Trade Organization. And especially since Donald Trump is obstructing the WTO, progressive voices have become more in favor of the WTO, which is still the same organization that I think many were resisting 20 years ago. So there's something strange happening there. And turning the WTO back to the GATT, so to say, would only be something like 25 years, going 25 years back in the past, and having a more modest system, and less intrusive trading system. Because the idea that WTO rules are beneficial for all, including the most vulnerable, is still the whole power politics versus rules debate that Ingo referred to, is quite complicated. And the same is true for EU trade agreements. We have, throughout the COVID, also continued to negotiate with New Zealand. We have continued to negotiate with Australia, with Chile. We have concluded an agreement with Mexico. We have, as the EU, tried to reinforce WTO rules and regimes, etc. Also, so I mean, you have the Mercosur agreement, and there's more and more, not least from the Netherlands, I think, more and more opposition against the Mercosur agreement in Europe. And I think many of us are aware of the potentially devastating consequences of the EU Mercosur agreement and what it reinforces in terms of deforestation, etc. Specifically, trade in meat and animal products. I think that we know that a lot of problems related to global justice relate to meat consumption. We are importing soy to feed pigs in Flanders in order to export pork to Africa and to Asia. So this is not really fair trade, I would say. So I think that could be one line to think about. Business and human rights legislation. A lot of NGOs are now working on that. Due diligence for companies, our companies. I emphasize this because Ingo also mentioned the trade and sustainable development chapters in EU trade agreements and the lack of enforceability. But my problem with that is if you frame the discussion in terms of enforceability, which is very often done, you again put the responsibility with third country governments, and there's a neo-colonial flavor to that. They are responsible for everything, And we forget then that it's our companies and also us as consumers that benefit from exploitation, right? So again, we are look away from systemic issues and from our benefits, and we put all the responsibility with third country governments, as happened recently in the case of Cambodia, for instance. So Cambodia has lost its trade preferences to the EU, so was sanctioned. And okay, that's an interesting case, and of course you can understand the logic of that decision, but okay, the impact, first of all, might be very limited. Cambodia is going to export more to China, and we still benefit, and our companies still benefit from low prices for many products from other countries. So make our companies accountable, and then also commodity prices. I already referred to it, and we have had in the 60s and 70s the debates on the new international economic order. And Ingo, I saw you wrote something about that, so we have to discuss that further. But I think there is, of course, something to learn from the dependency analysis of so many decades ago, that I mean, commodity prices, food prices are structurally low and fluctuating. And this is not going to be solved by making countries more productive or whatever, and also not by opening markets. Our markets, EU markets, are already very, very open for many, many products from all over the world. The structural problem is structurally low and unstable prices. And so I think we have to think more along these lines, along the lines of international commodity agreements. And interestingly, there is something going on when it comes to cocoa from Ivory Coast and Ghana. These two countries, they have last year, I think, established something like the COPEC. So they call it COPEC, so the OPEC for cocoa. Where these two countries that together export 60% of worldwide cocoa, they have formed sort of a cartel, or they're trying to form sort of a cartel with a relatively high price. And so our companies are forced to pay that price, otherwise they can simply not. So this is the idea. It looks beautiful. I'm not sure how it's going in practice, and to be honest, I don't think the COPEC has been documented a lot. So I would here too be happy to discuss more and to hear more your views on that. But I think this is an interesting phenomenon, something that was not supported by the EU, something that, as far as I know, was also not driven by the fair trade movement. But if that would be successful, it could be a big, huge step forward in terms of global justice. So my conclusion is, very briefly, if you go back to this triangle, I mean, you have seen a reinforcement of free trade, really, since COVID, despite some very small and temporary exceptions. But we have also seen an interesting embracement of geopolitical ideas, and it will be interesting to see how that evolves. Trade justice considerations have remained largely absent, but of course, just like Ingo, I also want to end with a positive note. There are things going on, of course. We see rising critiques, for instance, against the Mercosur agreements, and it will ultimately still depend on these three factors, these 3 points, to know to what extent paradigm change might, in the longer run, still be a feasible option. Thank you.
Thank you, Jan. I'm very happy how much these presentations are actually talking to each other, and I'm totally convinced that this is also going to be very much the case with Angela's presentation, who is going to similarly talk about the external impacts of the EU industrial policy and its effectiveness and distributive consequences. So very much in line. Few words about Angela. She's associate professor in international relations at Radboud University in Nijmegen. And she focuses mainly in her research on the capitalist crisis and crisis responses. So this is a perfect time for Angela, and floor is yours.
Okay, let me just get started.
I
will focus my contribution on the new EU industrial policy, which forms part of the wider competitiveness agenda of the EU. And I think my presentation very much speaks to Ingo's contribution on subsidies, because I will talk about state aid, and to Jan Orby's argument that neoliberalism is still going strong. Let me quickly, yeah. I will locate the EU industrial policy in the context of the EU rescue package, and especially the emergency state aids that we're seeing by the member states, by the individual member states, and the unseen quantitative easing by the European Central Bank. And I will try to locate this against the current structure of capitalism and where we find ourselves. We see many industrial sectors that do not invest. We have a world awash with cash, where corporations get indebted to finance share buybacks, or make dividend payments to shareholders, or to finance mergers and acquisitions, all financial activities that are not geared towards actual production. I mean, share buybacks and dividend payments in many sectors exceed investments in research and development. So these are the sort of the structural parameters of contemporary capitalism, where we have to understand EU industrial policy and the emergency state aid that is given to bail out the corporate sector at the moment. So focusing on EU industrial policy might sound off topic, given that the panel's theme is about the future of global governance. But I would argue that understanding the EU's global competitiveness strategy is crucial for understanding the role of EU global governance. And let me just make a quick tribute to the Euro-Memo group, which has, over the past 2 decades, like consistently critiqued the EU communications that used to be entrenched with notions of competitiveness, compete, competitors, competition. And this is really important. I mean, it was in 2000, back with the Lisbon agenda, that the Euro-Memo did this when the EU wanted to become the most dynamic and knowledge-based economy in the world. And it also critiqued the successor strategy, the Europe 2020 strategy. And it's a very appealing merchandising tactic of the EU, because competitiveness, or the ability to compete, sounds much more or better than fiscal austerity or the rhetoric of tightening the belt. And it evokes this imaginary of being part of a successful winning community.
Excuse me, I'm not sure whether you are still on the introductory slide, but
yeah,
yes.
you are. Yeah, yes, I will move on to the next slide.
Yeah, I just wanted to warn you that.
No, yeah, thank you. No, but I want to say, we as Euro-Memo, we need to critique competitiveness and as part of that in EU industrial policy, because what I will show is that in many cases, EU industrial policy is nothing else than the neoliberal structural adjustment that we've seen in the past, putting the burden of adjustment mostly on labor rather than capital, and benefiting mostly financial capital. So now my next slide, I hope you can see it. Great, excellent. If we take a global perspective, we see that industrial policy is back on the agenda of many parts of the world. If you take the latest UNCTAD report, you can read that 84 states have adopted some sort of industrial policy over the past 5 years. And obviously, alongside America First, Made in China 2025, or Make in India, we have the European Union, which has or the European Commission, who has issued this communication titled For a European Industrial Renaissance in 2014. So industrial policy is a top priority at EU level, and the EU is organizing not industry days, but entire industry weeks. And you could say that the revival of industrial policies may be astonishing, because the Treaty of Rome did not mention industrial policy with a word. That's a supranational industrial policy. But it has always formed a central pillar of European integration. And since the mid-1980s, the name industrial policy has withered away. I mean, DG industry has been abolished, and industrial policy has been denounced as inefficient and old-fashioned, and national governments picking winners was considered anti-competitive and really fiercely prosecuted by EU state aid rules. And now we see a comeback. So industrial policy is rising like a phoenix from its ashes. And also with the corona pandemic, state aid is now being generously permitted by the European Commission's DG Comp by making use of exemption clauses of the state aid law. And EU industrial policy is somewhat difficult to trace, because it's similar to what Jan Orby has outlined in his presentation, it's cross-cutting different directorate generals. It's blended into existing funding streams, such as the cohesion fund, and it's very difficult to disentangle. So also here we see a fragmentation, and I'm referring here to the European Industrial Renaissance communication. There have been many more ever since and before that, and it's not the most recent one, absolutely not. But I'm choosing this because it's quite telling in terms of the external dimension of EU industrial policy. So the goal is to make Europe future-proof, reverse the deindustrialization processes in Europe, and boost industrial competitiveness with the ultimate goal of inducing export-led growth. So the growing trade deficit with China is being problematized, and Chinese manufacturers catching up rapidly in the export of high value added manufacturing products. So the goal is to backshore manufacturing capacity from China emerging markets to Europe. How? The basic idea is to restore an attractive business climate, or an investment climate. It's all about investments. So the idea is to channel investments from this bloated financial sector into industrial upscaling in the real production economy. So, and similar to America First, the new EU industrial policy comes with this undertone of decoupling global value chains that Jan Orby has referred to as well. So you have to foster European value chains so that manufacturing export products can be labeled as made in Europe. So it's basically in one way also a bit of a EU first or make Europe great again strategy. And not unimportant in this respect, I mean, the European Commission didn't even bother to change the title. There was a previously issued document by the European Roundtable of Industrialists, which was EU Industrial Renaissance Agenda for Action, and where the ERT was giving sort of policy recommendations and policy priorities, instructions to the newly appointed commission. So we just that you have a sort of background where this is coming from. So briefly, what does the new EU industrial policy entail? I will not go through the different ingredients, and this is far from complete, but I think it should be, so it's quite telling. It comes with a whole range of flanking policies. Also, you know, refit, regulatory fitness and competitiveness proving, and the whole rim-ram of policy programs. You might wonder, or if you look at that, on the surface, it looks like a much needed structural industrial policy, which comes also with the air of some comprehensive Keynesian interventionist state policy. And it might suggest a move away from the neoliberal agenda of the past decades. But then if we look at how this should be financed, we have a sort of a reality check. The EU budget needs to be always in balance. So the EU cannot accumulate any debt. It cannot run a deficit, basically. So the method is, in addition to the different funds that the EU has established, which from 2021 onwards will all be labeled under EU Invest. But the main mechanism is leveraging private investment by using the EU budget or the different funds or the European Investment Bank as a guarantee or counter guarantee, as well as using the instrument of securitizing debt portfolios. And the expected leverage ratio is 1 to 30. So basically every euro spent or guaranteed is expected to induce 30 euros in private investment. So similar to Lehman Brothers, they also have 1 to 30 leverage ratio. So the point I would like to make is this EU industrial policy is geared towards seducing the financial sector to invest by offering in return sort of a socialization of the investment risks. And there is, in fact, underinvestment, if you like, if we compare it on a global scale. I mean, the European Commission speaks of extreme underinvestment. Private and public investment has gone down since the 1970s in the advanced capitalist world. And if you look at, for example, if you take gross fixed capital formation as an indicator, you see that the core EU countries, they're around 17% on average now, which compares to 45% in China or 30% in India. But investment has mostly fallen in the most crisis-hit countries. So basically, austerity has killed the appetite for investment. So investors don't invest in countries in a recession. So, but as I said, like the goal is of the EU industrial policy to boost the competitiveness. It's all about export-led growth as a strategy to overcome this crisis. Which basically means that European products have to become more attractive, speak cheaper on global markets, and so lowering prices will increase export. That is the expectation. And with the 19 Eurozone countries not being able to change their monetary or exchange rate policies, it all basically comes back to the good old neoliberal strategy of structural adjustment through internal devaluation as a substitute for currency devaluations. The internal devaluation is usually a mixed bag of structural changes, mostly consisting of labor and product market reforms or increasing labor market flexibility or reduced trade costs. And the European Commission has suggested a three-tier strategy once. I will not read that, but I think you will get the point. So, but it's all these strategies, they in one way or another devalue labor in turbo speeds, if you like. Even reducing corporate taxes is a redistribution of wealth from labor to capital. And how is this going to be achieved? I mean, what is the institutional nexus for this? I mean, if you think back in 2012, we had the 4 presidents report suggesting competitiveness pacts. And then in 2015, we had the 5 president reports suggesting competitiveness authorities. And then discussions went on and we had national competitiveness authorities, and they, at some point, they became the competitiveness boards, and now we're, since 2008, since 2 years, every country in the member state should have a national productivity board. You always see this in politics of the EU. So it starts with authority and then it becomes board and at some point forum. So we are at the board level in, regarding this one particular pillar of EU industrial policy. These national productivity boards, they're the key touchstone of internal devaluation. They're meant as an auxiliary to the European semester, and they have to report to the European Commission and assess whether wages are evolving in line with productivity and in comparison with other Eurozone members and the main comparable trading partners. The central competitiveness indicator, they use many indicators that they report to the European Commission, is unit labor costs. Competitiveness can be improved by reducing unit labor costs. And we have seen the scoreboards of unit labor costs in the Memoranda of Understanding, 6-pack, Euro Plus pack, the European semester. And with the establishment of national productivity boards, all member states should not only the deficit countries under the excessive deficit procedure should step up reform efforts, but all member states. And they have to do this in a competitive fashion. I always have to bring in this particular sheet because nobody believes me if I say that this is actual policy. So what we see here is the first sign of EU interventionism in wage policy, if you like. So differences in unit labor costs among member states are seen as the core problem for economic asymmetries. So it's not the uneven positions in value chains and the processes of deindustrialization. It's basically blaming the periphery mostly for pricing themselves out of the market. Because if you look at the southern periphery, since 2000, unit labor costs have increased like 30% faster than in Germany, for example. So the argument very often is, and over the past 6-7 years, that the South has had wage increases beyond what could be justified on the basis of efficient production. So reducing labor costs, in other words, serves to improve returns on capital. That's a point I would like to make. And I would like to locate this into the context of the measures taken in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. We're witnessing once more a massive redistribution of wealth, which primarily benefits the financial and production-oriented capital at the expense of labor, if you look at the different pillars of EU industrial policy. We see major emergency bailout packages that keep companies afloat. Governments are splashing with cash with very few strings attached. We see guarantees for bank loans, meaning that investment risks of the financial sector are being socialized again. We see interest-free loans, we see liquidity agreements, we see a very generous tax breaks that are granted. So it's not just this 750 billion euro recovery plan, but I think that that's only a fraction of the hundreds of billions of euros of state aid that individual member states are currently granting. And already in May, the aggregate state aid has reached more than 10% of the EU's GDP. We must be far beyond now. I mean, just prior to the presentation, I tried to calculate how much state aid has been granted by the European Commission as part of a fast-track procedure. And I got lost. The list is too long. I mean, I would need more time to really work that up, and I will do that. And we have to see that in addition to the emergency package of more than 1 trillion euros to deal with the crisis by the European Central Bank, the PEP, the Pandemic Emergency Purchase Program. Quantitative easing is generally not considered state aid, but it is. I mean, the ECB is printing billions of euros a month to buy up corporate bonds. And it does so not only on primary markets, it does so on secondary, not only on secondary market, it does so on primary markets. So the ECB is directly buying bonds with Shell and Philips. And as part of the asset purchasing program of the ECB, there are also non-performing loans being bought up, which basically means that more and more sort of zombie companies are kept artificially alive. And it is freeing the financial sector from their junk bonds that do not produce any yield. So we see that who's benefiting from this? I mean, the banks benefit immensely, the financial sector, because the risks for issuing loans are socialized by state guarantees. They're not hooked up with the sort of zombification of the economy that we're witnessing. Banks can even take out special loans from the ECB and receive 1% interest in addition. I mean, so the negative interest rates for bank loans, provided that they can prove that the loans will flow into the real economy. So, but the bigger point I would like to make here, and I have to bring in Marx, EU industrial policy, and also the response to the pandemic is geared towards seducing the financial sector to invest at a time when contemporary capitalism is taking a sort of parasitic form. Corporations take on debt. There's free money available there, I mean, low interest rates, to finance share buybacks, to pay out dividends, to finance mergers and acquisitions, amounts that exceed research and development. To give you an example, I mean, the pharmaceutical industry is receiving taxpayers' money to develop a vaccine against COVID-19 right now. Big Pharma invests more money in financial activities and mergers and acquisitions than in research and development. Big Pharma's indebtedness has increased gigantically. Loans are not taken out for research and development, but share buybacks. The amount of dividends paid to Big Pharma shareholders is higher than what is invested in research and development. So, and at the same time, if you combine that, we have internal devaluation, lower wages translating in more profits at company level that are not invested in actual production. So it renders EU industrial policy and the whole bailout futile. If you look at this more structurally, and I hope I can write a paper about that. So we have, on the one hand, we have the class dimension of these policies, but we also have a sort of EU industrial policy, and also the COVID-induced measures will exacerbate structural asymmetries within the EU further in terms of the north-south, the west-east divide. Asymmetries that have increased since the last crisis. I mean, they have been there from at the outset, but they've only become stronger, and they will become stronger again with the COVID-19 pandemic. So, I mean, Germany has announced that the emergency loans, so the individual state aid, will probably amount to 28% of the GDP. So it's, I think, in terms of critiquing the EU industrial policy as a sort of general block and the current measures, we have to look at the sort of the structural capitalist development of what's going on. I mean, in terms of investment and policies trying to seduce the financial sector and companies to invest in actual production, which is not taking place right now. So that's why there are even phases in the life of modern nations when everybody is seized with a sort of craze for making profit without producing. I think it's this phase that we're continue to be in and haven't gotten out since 2008. And I will end here.
Thank you so much, Angela, for this amazing presentation. Yeah, so this panel is not, I assume, making many of us much more optimistic about putting down neoliberalism, or at least somehow ushering in a more progressive imaginary. But let us do now the second short kind of reflections by the panelists on the questions that have come through the chat. In the order how you have presented, and then we will open up the floor to all the other attendees to ask questions live. So I will first ask a question for Ingo. They'll accept, of course, for some compliments. The question comes here from doesn't matter. So is really the fragmentation, according to you, Ingo, problem, or is the problem the power asymmetries within the state apparatus, as Poulantzas would have had it? So structural selectivity, really, of the state.
Yeah. So what I've tried to suggest in the presentation is that fragmentation is also perhaps primarily an expression of that asymmetry. So I don't see those as two different phenomena, but very intrinsically linked. Perhaps with fragmentation, given still a broader take on that selectivity of the state, which then so to focus on the sectoral interests of environment versus the economy, and how those sectoral interests yes compete within the state, and they are you're quite right to draw to the asymmetry already in power there, but how they then also institutionalize within the European Union, and for the European Union's external policy also internationally. So I think of fragmentation really as a continuation of that struggle and the asymmetries of that struggle. I do think that there are a few mechanisms within many states that have a potential to bring those perspectives into contact with one another. I don't want to say to harmonize not, or to unify, maybe not, but at least to put them into contact in cabinets, in parliaments, whereas in their European and even more so international institutionalization, you do not even have that conflict. So you live happily in splendid isolation as a trade lawyer in Geneva, and you do not need at all to interact with those around the corner in the Human Rights Council, right? Whereas in the domestic context, there's at least the need to acknowledge each other's existence, which with further internationalization, institutionalization there, I think there's even less of that.
Thanks, Ingo. Now we go to Jan. So first question, Jan, do you see that basically left is, well, in some ways failing really to redefine the crisis? So, progressive forces are, having very little impact because they are already failing at the first prong of your change, in the sense that they either excluded or not so much left into the institutions, or what Ingo would say, if you have sufficiently fragmented institutions, it's very difficult to penetrate any kind of epistemic community with their own forms of narratives and justifications and reasoning that is very difficult to displace. So why is left not able to kind of get a bigger influence on what is crisis that we need to solve? Second small challenge, namely, that the resilience system is not focused necessarily on individuals, but it is also about institutional change. And final question here is, so with regard to your kind of recommendations, there have been quite a few commodity agreements in the past between 30s and 70s in particular, for example, for sugar, but why didn't they work? So why didn't they work as a means to kind of protect developing countries and their economic interests?
All right, thank you. Great questions. Difficult to answer. Has the left failed? The short answer is yes, I think. The little bit longer answer is that I think that if you compare it to 10 years ago when we had the financial crisis hitting us, I think the progressive side has built up more expertise and more networks. So I think there is an evolution there. I think there are more alternative studies ready than there used to be. So maybe the answer is slightly more optimistic. However, I think there is something, and I don't want to generalize, of course, but very often you see a lot of hesitance to critique free trade, because free trade has, I think, for some progressive people, organizations, still the connotation of being leading to peace and prosperity. And the whole narrative that being against free trade means protectionism and war is still a very dominant one, and one that has an impact, I think, on many of us. And the counter discourses are there and are being built, but have proven not to be so strong, and also not to be ready when the crisis here, the COVID crisis, erupted. And then on resilience, yes, if you would go for a resilient system, then I would agree with the person who asked the question. But the whole resilience discourse in this case has been about resilience of workers. So the answer, the solution to the crisis would be to be more resilient. I mean, relating to Angela's story, that would be to be more productive. The responsibility is with labor, so to say. And secondly, with supply chains. So we have to make sure that supply chains are more resilient. But what does that mean? More resilient supply chains means that maybe we can more easily shift to another country when Bangladesh or Vietnam is hit by COVID or another disease. We have to be able to be more easily shift towards another country that is also resilience in a way. So the whole discourse about resilience was not about resilience of the system, but about resilience of people and of chains. And then the question, Ingo, on the new international economic order and the international commodity arrangements, I haven't studied this in depth, of course, but I know there are many analyses pointing out that I think on the one hand, the, how to say, structural imperatives of capitalism and ever more profit-seeking dynamic has really emerged in the 70s and continued over the 80s. I also think that the commodity power of some countries in the South was short-lived. I mean, it was a very brief, quite unique period in history where their commodity powers seemed to be relatively large, but then that quickly disappeared. And then, of course, you have also seen that elites in these countries have very easily become co-opted and very easily become part of the system. On the north side, so to say, oligopoly, supermarkets, financial speculation. I mean, a lot of interests behind. Behind, how to say, the fight against the cartels, and that has made it practically impossible to keep these sustainable.
I've forgotten one more question by Lawrence, namely, what about the counter argument that, you know, if we cannot get other agreements such as, you know, social or environmental agreements, well, better we do trade and hope for the best.
Yes, I think it's a very pragmatic and probably too pragmatic option, because you know, this is the common discourse in Brussels is that we have trade agreements and we have a lot of trade power, and we use that as a leverage for sustainable goals, and then this sustainable development chapter is the leverage. What you see in practice is the opposite. It's the sustainable development chapter that serves as a leverage to get the free trade agreements approved. Many of these agreements, including already the one with Colombia, Peru, the one with Vietnam, the one with Mercosur is already now under a lot of contestation. Many of these free trade agreements would never have been approved had there not been a sustainable development chapter that serves to legitimize the agreement in the European Parliament, for instance, in some member states, which are increasingly, also in Belgium, we had the whole, also in the Netherlands, the discussions on CETA. I mean, so I think the idea that trade agreements can serve as a leverage to advance such goals is a bit naive, because in practice we have seen the opposite dynamic going on. And I'm not aware of any studies that show the social and ecological cost of a trade agreement on the one hand, and then the benefit of the sustainable development chapters on the other hand, and have weighted these. But I'm pretty sure that the second column would be slightly lighter than the first one.
Thanks a lot, Jan. A couple of questions for Angela. So Angela, don't you still see a certain shift in competitiveness paradigm, especially because we are moving toward stricter forms of investment controls, screening and promoting strategic value chains? So that would be one question. Another person wonders whether we can improve competitiveness by increasing labor productivity. In fact, then I will leave Jeremy's question for perhaps personal engagement, because it's for all three speakers. And then, you know, my question is, you know, so how bad does it have to get before it gets better? So in a way, so like when the contradictions play out in some better, you know, because this seems to be in terms of socialization and transfer of capital, just so enormous that at some point, you know, something has to happen. And what is then that what will happen?
Oh yeah, of course, I have to respond. The question about shifts, or whether there's a paradigm shift in competitiveness when looking at the sort of the investor screening that the EU wants to adopt, like similar to the United States, which is pretty much targeting Chinese investment. The US has a similar scheme. I had a student writing a bachelor thesis about that, and I should have learned a lot more from that and be able to sort of tease out the details of that. But it is a sort of a protectionist attempt which does not mean that competitiveness will and continues to be measured in terms of unit labor costs as one indicator. I mean, the EU uses many different indicators, but this is a central one that we see recurring in many sort of the crisis measurement. It might be like the European semester now sort of have be put on ice for a while, but it definitely comes back in the assessment of how to improve economies and make them competitive. The investment protection scheme is something that's it's being created right now, so we have to look at that very, very carefully. Also, as Euromemo group, I think I can't say more on that part. And then there was the question of yeah, we can improve productivity. Indeed, because how can unit labor costs be reduced? You can just increase labor productivity, and if you can't improve productivity, what is left is the orthodox neoliberal recipe of just cutting wages. And productivity itself has slowed down since the 1970s, and some sectors are very difficult to make more productive. Think about tourism. I mean, you can make also a barber cut beards quicker, and you have a sort of improved productivity. But we have a service industry that is very difficult to make more productive. Obviously, we're now in the transition of including more robotics and the digitalization of whatever steps in the production. With the Industry 4.0 type of initiatives, new technologies, artificial intelligence, cloud computing, you name it, 3D printing, all this will indeed give a productivity boost. But if labor is still being measured in terms of unit labor costs and put into competition, I mean, it's not just, I had several discussions with other scholars, like it's not a bad thing to measure unit labor costs, but it is if you use it as an indicator that puts different economies and workers into direct competition with each other. And we're now in competition measured with the unit labor costs in China and India. And I think, I mean, in addition to reducing wage costs, you can also cut non-wage costs. So employers' social security contributions, it also reduces unit labor costs, which basically means another attack on the welfare regimes, or make labor markets more flexible, or a further decentralization and weakening of collective bargaining. And it's very interesting to see that the European Commission has sort of threatened organized labor, ETUC, to take the reports of the national productivity boards very seriously. This should be part of the wage negotiations, what sort of the output of these institutions. Yeah, so we can increase productivity, but definitely not in the service sectors that, especially, I mean, in tourism in southern periphery of Europe. How bad will it get, Maria? What else needs to happen? Yeah, I can't look into the future. I think we're not there yet. So somehow it has to get worse until things start to change even further. So I'm not really ending on a positive note, I think. Mm. We're all indebted. We're disciplined by debt. I mean, imagine that since 2010, what is it? Global debt has tripled ever since. I mean, you have some more conservative estimates. So this financial bubble is continuing to increase. And we have household debt, we have corporate debt, we have sovereign debt, and as soon as we cannot service our debt anymore on an aggregate scale, we will have the next crisis. So if the accumulation of debt gets out of sync with the accumulation of capital, a real fundamental crisis erupts with major struggles for redistribution. Who has to pay what? And it's going to be tough if you look at the bloated financial sector trying to issue ever more debt onto society, or yeah.
And this of course combines with the climate crisis, which is going to, which is ongoing and waiting to burst. Okay, so we now will ask two of our participants to ask the question in person. I'm first unmuting Jeremy, who has a wonderful question. Jeremy Lehman. Jeremy, I've unmuted you. Oh no, wait, still not. Ask to unmute. Okay. Okay, still it's a little bit more complicated because I think it needs to go through Jonas. Yeah, now talking permitted. Am I right? Jonas, do you think I'm doing it correctly?
Normally you should be able to talk now, because
but I still see next to him like talking permitted and next now.
Is that better? Yeah.
Perfect, Jeremy. Thank you.
Well, I'll make things easier by just reading my question, if that's all right. I mean, there were three terrific, well-focused contributions. I enjoyed all three of them, and they chime with so much of what I'm convinced about. But above all, they stress the deep embeddedness of neoliberal institutions and basic obstacles to progress, both in law and political practice. Now, the left is taking some comfort from the so-called disruptive potential of COVID, the COVID crisis, as it did from the 2008 crisis. But it strikes me that the constellation of corporate and political power is demonstrating a resilience of the status quo, and by thereby demonstrating the scale of the challenge facing a progressive eco-social transition. Do you agree, as a first obstacle, we should be aiming our weapons at financialized capitalism and the colossal disruptive role that financialized capitalism has been playing for the last 3 or 4 decades, and disabling financialized capital has to be an indispensable precondition for a Green New Deal. Do you agree? Basically.
Thank you, Jeremy. I will now ask Jamel to ask the question. Talking permitted. Jamel, please, the floor is yours.
Yes, I hope you can hear me. My question was for Jan. I'm not a specialist about political discourses about globalization and free trade agreement, but I have the feeling that with the position of Danny Roderick and others, I have the feeling that we need to explore the possibility to have a shallow globalization, a thinner globalization, to have a more resilient system, a more resilient global economic system. So I had the feeling that in this branch of the literature, we have a possibility to build a more resilient system, in the sense that a more resilient system will be reinforced by shock instead of the reverse. So it was my feeling, but maybe I'm wrong because I'm not specialist of all political discourses. And I had another question for Angela. I quote one of your papers in my own paper. So it's about discourses about competitiveness. And I will not be in favor to reject this notion of competitiveness, because there is always two sides of competition. There is a good side in the sense that we'll be stimulating autonomy, creativity, and etc. And there is another side in which we have a bad competition, in which we have it will reinforce a bad aspect of human life. And that was my observations and my question. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm still asking our participants whether somebody would like to ask more questions, but it seems so far we are fine. And also in terms of time, I think it makes quite some sense that we now go to the last words of the speakers. Everybody is most welcome to kind of reflect on the questions that have been posed and, you know, just generally reflect on whatever they would like to reflect, minute or two, and then we go toward the end. Ingo first, we do just this.
Yeah, thanks so much. So I didn't say before how much I also enjoyed Jans and Angela's presentations. There's so much resonance. So this will be a great conversation, but it's also to steal a bit of time for the, but it's genuine. So I really, I do think so. It's also giving me a bit of time to see what I kind of want to say about the questions that do not allow me to retreat to some black letter provisions on which I feel more comfortable to speak of the law. So I don't know. So I mean, this is whether we can do much without unless we give up on and remove the obstacle of functionalized capitalism. Yeah, so I tend to think that I would pause for a second and hope that there's some things we can do in the meantime, because I don't think that that's around the corner. And I also think that there are incremental steps of working against excesses. And I again think of the law and the way it, for instance, creates hierarchies between different debtors and privileges financial institutions, and where there's small interventions that could unhinge some of the privileged position that finance holds at the moment. And I think that those interventions are feasible with good lawyering and some more political momentum, that would go some ways without necessarily claiming victory over financialized capitalism, in the sense that it is removed for good. That would be my take on this.
There is a small reaction to you from Jeremy to you in the chat, but we have to go to now Jan.
Okay, so well, the question on financialized capitalism also not core to my research, so I'm also a bit hesitant, but I tend to agree with the critical view that this is a huge driver behind a lot of the things that are going wrong. And also in response to Ingo's earlier question on the commodity agreements of the 70s and why they failed, I think financial speculation has been core, etc. But I look forward to hearing Angela's reply, because that is really core to her research. On Jamal's question, so I think we probably agree. I would largely also side with Danny Roderick's call for a thinner globalization. And when I said that losing the WTO should not be as dramatic as it is often perceived, and we, for instance, that would merely mean going back to the GATT in 1995. That is a thinner globalization, right? It's just my problem is rather with the word resilience and with the concept of resilience. And I'm not sure if Roderick uses that concept in his arguments. I don't remember him using it actually, but I may have certainly missed it. It's rather the concept of resilience that can be dangerous, because it has a tendency to point to individual responsibilities and consequences of crisis rather than structural factors and causes of crisis. But you have to read my blog on that, and then please come back to me and we can discuss it further.
Thanks, Jan. Now it's Angela's time. It's a great time for a researcher of crisis. Go ahead, Angela.
Yeah, I have to take up Jeremy's point, whether we see sort of the resilience of the status quo in terms of financial capital being at the top of the hierarchy. And I would say absolutely, and there will be no change as long as we restore existing power balances. So we have financial capital at the top, followed by transnational production-oriented capital, and then let's say more sort of local, small and medium-sized focused capital fractions, somewhere deep down there, labor. What we see is right now, if we look at the bailout packages, we really have to look at what not only the ECB is doing, but also the Fed and the Bank of England and the Swiss Federal Bank, because they're buying up all the junk that's out there. Which is another bailout for the financial sector. So it's very often argued that this crisis is so much different. Now we have like real production economy being in distress and receiving bailouts. If you look at the sort of the composition of what is actually happening, it's if you take out the US, the Fed, it's trillions of dollars that are being produced, while we have like 35% of people having lost their jobs. There has been a silent bailout also of the shadow banking system, because it was about to collapse, and it's through central banks buying up their assets and storing it on their balance sheets, and they will never move back into the markets again. But they can continue sort of. There's a continuous bailout going on in terms of if we look at the central bank monetary policy that is happening. So the power relations are restored through what is happening right now. That would be my answer to Jeremy. In terms of, yeah, we have this wall of money out there searching for yields that is growing ever bigger. I mean, this term wall of money came from this IMF person. And we will not get any further if this continues to be in place with a state system that enforces debt repayments, and the EU total structure state apparatus being part of that regard to sovereign debt. To the question of, there's also good sides to competition. Yeah, absolutely. We should put sort of the meaning back of where competition, the word comes from, competere, the Latin word of running and striving together, which is not about price competition and undercutting wages as we see it right now in the context of the European Union and globally. So we should never compete on the basis of the cost of labor, and then we're fine. I mean, competition, striving together, learning from each other. There's also solidarity aspect to the word competition. There's nothing wrong in producing innovative and great, fantastic products. But this is learning from each other. And the competition that we're seeing, and also I've done like a decade more research on EU competition policy. It's price competition that is taken as the central benchmark for assessing whether a certain company is competitive or not. And the left has misunderstood this, like still does, thinking that whenever we have price competition, there's less, and prices move to the marginal production costs, basically, that capital is making less profit, so that we have a sort of redistributive effect through price competition. It's bollocks. It's competition is all about labor costs at the end, because laborers are considered a part of the variable costs that go into production. So competition, yes, but not on the basis of labor.
On this note. I want to say happy note, but not possible. But I mean, on this good critical note, I would like to thank all the panelists, but let me first, however, do what I'm supposed to do. Namely, I would like to remind you that tomorrow at 9 start the small sessions or working groups or working panels. Please do join. The topics are amazing. Yeah, so there is a lot of competition between the different parallel workshops, so please do join. And let us thank our amazing speakers today, who were just stellar, as I promised you. So it's all my doing. So thank you a lot. And we have tried to unmute, so everybody now can speak. Jeremy asked us to enable people to clap to the panelists, because this is what we are missing. So everybody can unmute themselves and clap to this wonderful panel and for a wonderful discussion. I'm starting. It's not working very well, but very well. You get at least my clapping. So thanks a lot. And I hope I will see some of you tomorrow and on Thursday, and have a lovely evening. Pity we can't have drinks or anything else, but it is what it is. So thanks a lot.
Thank you. Thanks,
Bye.
Thank you for excellent sharing. Thank you.
Bye.
Fantastic. And thanks for the wonderful questions. So
Yes.
very important ones to continue.
Thanks to everybody who took part. Bye.
Okay, bye.